Welcome to Chapter 6, Buyer Counseling. There's a lot of information in this chapter about working with buyers and a lot of good information that you can use in your everyday practice. So you certainly want to be familiar with all of the items and all of the content here with this chapter. I'm really going to go through and really highlight the more critical things I want you to be aware of when you're preparing for your final examination and the kinds of things that you'll be tested on. So you won't have to be tested on everything in this chapter, but quite a bit of this is important information for you. And as I said, I'll try to highlight the more critical concepts that students tend to have trouble with, and then you can certainly go back and read more thoroughly for more information. So let's begin, and we'll start with conducting a buyer counseling session, which is on one of your first meetings with the buyer. You would conduct this counseling session, and would find this on page 102. And essentially, with your first introductory meetings with the buyer, you're going to be trying to build some rapport with them. Disclose your agency status, whether you're going to be their agent or whether you're going to work with them as a customer. Determine what they've seen. Determine their price range, motivation. Perform a needs assessment. Discuss financing, and obtain a commitment that they're actually willing to really do this. Obtaining commitment to me is look for motivation. Are they motivated to buy, or is this one of these where if there's a good deal out there, we'll buy it. If not, we'll just waste your time. So motivation is important, I think, as far as the commitment. And you might also have them go through any of the contracts here with obtaining the commitment, which would be a buyer agency contract, because you're going to find out just how committed they are if they in fact sign a representation agreement with you, a brokerage agreement to represent them. So all important areas in the counseling session with the buyers. In performing a needs assessment you might want to use a form. And there's a sample of one on page 103, the kinds of things you might ask a buyer. Just remember, if you do a needs assessment, if you do use a form, use it and use it exactly the same way for all the buyers that you work with. Fill one out on each buyer. Don't do it for some buyers and not other buyers. Okay, so be consistent with using that. The purpose of the counseling session is not to develop an offer from them or to discuss negotiation strategies. At this first buyer counseling session, you're looking to determine needs versus wants. You're looking to determine their financial ability and their motivation. There are three types of buyer agency agreement. The first is the exclusive buyer agency agreement, which means that buyer needs to buy with you, or he's going to be paying you a commission. So an exclusive buyer agency agreement means that for the time I'm looking for a property in this specific area, because typically these buyer agency agreements you have to identify the area that you're going to be working with the buyer looking for homes. But the exclusive buyer agency, the kind of the downside to that is that many buyers don't want to sign those, because it means if they don't like you and they walk away from you and buy with somebody else, they may still owe you a commission, or your brokerage firm a commission. The exclusive agency buyer agreement is one, and also with the exclusive buyer agency agreement, buyers must give you financial information if requested by the agent. Something you want to remember later on for your final exam. Buyers with the exclusive buyer agency agreement specifically say they'll give you the financial information that you want, what you need. With the exclusive agency buyer agency agreement, a commission is due to the agent only if the buyer buys from the agent. So the exclusive agency buyer agency says, okay, buyer, you can work with me. If you don't like me and you wander off and buy from somebody else, you don't owe me a commission. So the buyer is entitled to either work with another agent, or the buyer can buy through his own efforts and not have to pay a commission. The open buyer agency agreement basically says The buyer has no loyalty to any one agent. Whatever agent engages him in a sales contract that leads to the conclusion of a sale, that's the agent that gets paid. The exclusive buyer agency and exclusive agency buyer agency are pretty confusing terms. I wish we could come up with something a little better than that, and I've got some suggestions, but we won't get into them here. But what I think you might want to know is notice that with the exclusive agency buyer agency, notice how the word buyer is between agency and agency, almost like you have a buyer in between two agents. You might want to think that that emphasizes that the buyer doesn't have to pay an agent if in fact he buys from another agent. So the exclusive buyer agency agreement, that means the buyer can not sell it by himself. The exclusive agency buyer agency says that either the buyer or the agent can engage in the contract and not have to pay a commission. This is more confusing than it probably really is. So when you see agency buyer agency, again, think that the buyer or the agent can engage someone in a contract and get paid. The one above it, only the agent can find the seller, if you will, or do the deal. The open buyer agency agreement, again, is any agent that engages the buyer in a contract gets paid the commission. So in the exclusive agency buyer agency, the buyer can find his own property and not pay a commission. And again, we have the buyer and the two agents on either side. So that would say that a buyer can find his own deal, or if the agent finds the own deal, then the only difference between the exclusive buyer agency and the exclusively agent buyer agency, the only difference between those two is that the exclusive agency buyer agency, the buyer can buy it for sale by owner if he wants to and not have to pay a commission. Realtor Code of Ethics, page 109, in dealing with buyers, the Realtor Code of Ethics, and again, this only applies to those people that belong to the National Association of Realtors, a local board, and a state association. They have some in the Code of Ethics, they have listed some ethical requirements in dealing with buyers. And you'll find that on page 109. You won't have any of this on your exam because it deals with realtors, and not all of you are realtors, so it's not fair to ask you questions on the Realtor Code of Ethics. But for those of you that are realtors, just be aware that the Code of Ethics also outlines some of your obligations and duties when representing buyers. We have to make disclosures to our buyers, the same disclosures to the buyers that you'd make to the sellers under a listing agreement. You explain the form of agencies available to the buyers and the rights and responsibilities of each under each type of agency, those three types we just talked about. Disclosure and consent to dual agency. When you have them sign the buyer brokerage agreement, there should be some clause in there that discloses and gives consent to dual agency. You'll get the confirmation later under the sales contract. Specific services that you're going to provide to the buyer client. Source and amount of compensation, who's going to pay you, the typical amount of compensation you get paid, which is a percentage of the transaction or a split or whatever it might be. Disclosure of contemporaneous offers. We've talked about this a couple times. We know that page 113 gives us a good form on if we're going to show our buyer clients the same property, we have to disclose this. Designated agents' duties to buyers, page 109. These are the duties that you're going to offer your buyers. This is way beyond minimum services, isn't it? This is sort of like all the things you should be offering. Help identify properties for them to look at, usually through the multiple listing service. If it's a commercial broker, then you use maybe a CoStar or a LoopNet kind of thing. Even the NAR site, the Realtor.com site. So help them identify properties in the multiple listing services. Arrange for property inspections. Advise buyers to the pricing of comparable properties, and advise them on the pricing of perhaps their offer they might want to make on this property. Provide confidentiality on anything the buyer discloses to you. Make sure you assist them in negotiating their contracts. Buyer services, we assess needs, we then select properties to see, we show those properties, we help negotiate, and then we follow up after the transaction's over. Buyers do tell their, designated agents do tell their buyers. There are some things that my scope of authority will limit my service to, and that would be where they are telling buyers that they're going to also enter in exclusive broker relationships with other buyers that may in fact buy properties that might be exactly the same property that they're working on. So just because I'm going to work with one buyer doesn't mean I have to exclude other buyers. I can represent them too. You're going to tell a buyer that you might end up showing the same properties to your client buyers. You're going to say that you're not an expert in regard to things like surveys and title searches and even inspections, that they can expect to hire other outside experts to do this thing. And so from the beginning you don't hold yourself out to knowing anything about this, that they should rely on you for, that you need to get these outside experts. Designated agent says, and also buyer, I'm not going to be responsible if some listing agent that put the property in the MLS or advertising has inaccuracies in it. I owe no duty to a buyer, nor do I have no authority on behalf of a buyer other than what's set forth in this agreement. This is going to be the limited scope of my authority, what we agree to in writing here. Don't assume I'm supposed to do more for you. Also, Mr. Buyer, you may have to make disclosures as required by law, and I'm duty bound to help you do that. You can show properties that are listed in the MLS by brokers, designated agents. You can actually show property that may be not listed in the MLS with proper documentation and permission. I'm not obligated to show you properties that are for sale but not listed in the MLS, but that doesn't mean you can't, but you're not obligated to find for sale by owners for them, for instance. Buyer's duties under an exclusive buyer agency agreement. This is the buyer agency agreement. This is where only one agent is given the authority to help the buyer buy, and will get paid whether the buyer buys through his own efforts or some other agent helps the buyer buy. So our duties here would be, as stated on page 115, the important one is that the buyer must comply with any reasonable requests to supply the agent relevant information, financial information on the buyer. The buying process, we have offers and we have negotiations and we have this thing called a closing. Just prior to closing, we have a final property inspection, and then at that closing we'd also be given a survey of the property by a survey company. Closing costs, and a lot of this stuff on closing that is in your book is going to come up again in another chapter, chapter 10 in this book, so you don't have to cover closing too thoroughly at this time. We'll cover it more thoroughly under chapter 10, but just a couple of items. There are closing costs involved in a real estate transaction. Notice that we're generally going to use the HUD-1 form. There's a copy of that on page 211 for residential real estate transactions, not for commercial transactions. We should know that, so that's the HUD-1 form, page 211. We'll, again, take another look at that later. The HUD-1 form is prepared either by buyer's, lender, or seller's attorney. Real estate brokers and their agents really are not empowered to complete closing statements that are going to be used at closing. Now, you can prepare a seller's net sheet. You can compare, a buyer's, what I need to close if you want to do that, but those are not going to be used at the closing table. Transfer tax. Be a little careful with transfer tax at the closing, because in some cases we have state transfer taxes due. In some areas we have what I call transactions taxes, which is what the buyer pays. So depending, the seller may be paying state taxes and local taxes. Typically what happens is the seller pays the state transfer tax and a buyer pays a local transaction tax. All this is a way of raising revenue for either the state or government or the county government or a local municipality. And that's why they're there. They don't do anything more than just charge people to do their real estate deals. The total amount due at closing, we're going to have buyer's charges and debits. There's going to be prorations between the parties. There'll be settlement charges paid from the borrower's funds and some from the seller's funds. We're going to total all the buyer's debits minus the buyer's credits. The buyer's credits are the monies that go to a buyer. So a credit in a real estate transaction is money we give to people, sort of credit them with. And a debit is something we take away from them. So if we take all of the buyer's costs, buyer debits, and we subtract it from the buyer's credits, the money he gets, for instance, the mortgage money would be a big credit, that would equal the amount of the cash, equal the amount that the buyer must bring to closing. And this should be somewhat in the area of that GFE, which we'll talk about in another chapter, which is a good faith estimate, which is what the loan officer gave to the potential borrower when he borrowed money. That GFE should be some approximation to what in fact they have to bring to closing. Chapter 6, Buyer Counseling Review Quiz. Take that. Good luck.